Recognizing the House Leader for the third party.
Thank you, and nice to see you, Minister. Just wanting to ask a few questions here as we get closer to the end of the day. This question is on the West Coast gas transmission project that is currently before the Minister, Enbridge. There's a fairly consequential decision that is likely to determine the future of this project. Enbridge is seeking an extension and claiming two specific circumstances: a COVID-19 pandemic and the uncertainty in the natural gas permitting following the Yahey decision. Section 46 of the Environmental Assessment Act grants power to order a variation only if there's, quote, an emergency or other comparable circumstances, and if this emergency is in the public interest. The question is to the Minister: will the Enbridge's West Coast gas transmission permit be renewed?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. As I think the member knows, there has been public consultation on Enbridge's request. That material is not yet finalized, nor has it been referred to me, so no decision has yet been made.
Member.
Thank you. We received a letter that was copied to us from one of the First Nations hereditary chiefs from up north. Has the Minister engaged with the hereditary chiefs that have reached out, and kind of what interactions and engagement is there in this situation?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I have not engaged personally, but the Environmental Assessment Office staff have.
Member.
Just wanting to thank you to the Minister. Just wanting to ask a question or two here with respect to carbon offsets and carbon credits. We've engaged on this in question period. The province has planned to proceed with fossil fuel expansion while achieving net zero appears to be largely dependent, and I recognize the Minister in his response to me the other day in question period highlighted a number of different potential options to reach net zero. But it appears that there's a heavy reliance, or there could potentially be a heavy reliance on carbon credits and offsets. The new output-based pricing system that when I entered the room, the Minister was talking about for large emitters is also expected to rely on these programs. Reports have found that corporate and government-run offset programs are unreliable and repeatedly over-account actual emissions reductions. A study done by the University of Berkeley this year demonstrated that carbon offset registries have, quote, consistently allowed developers to claim far more climate-saving benefits than justified, end quote. A separate report by the UN declared that high-value carbon credits can be used for beyond a value chain mitigation, but cannot be counted towards a non-state actor's interim emissions reductions required by its net zero pathway. Given that these experts from around the world have criticized carbon offset programs for being unreliable and repeatedly over-accounting actual emissions reductions, will the government submit to an external independent review of their carbon offset program?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the member for the question, because it's an important one, and I agree, that where offsets are used, they need to be credible, they need to be verifiable, they need to be real. I do want to add that the member is making an assumption that we will largely meet emission reduction standards through, or net zero standards where they apply through the use of offsets, and that decision has not been made. But what I will say is we will always want to put an emphasis on available real emission reduction efforts first. In terms of the offset protocols that have been used by this government and would be in the future, we rely on the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance, which is an international body, a third party, that works toward ensuring that offset schemes undergo a third-party audit process based on ICROA's Code of Best Practice, which is designed to align with UNFCCC. ICROA reviewed the legislative and regulatory frameworks around protocols in British Columbia and gave them a seal of approval, if you wish, as well as individual protocols that have been used. And as the member knows, we are currently finalizing a forest carbon offset protocol 2.0, which will be finalized this spring, and it too will be subject to that third-party verification according to ICROA protocols.
Member.
Thank you. Of the mechanisms that the minister shared with me in question period, and maybe for the benefit of this, you can choose to or not to list them off again. Where does carbon offset, carbon credit programs rank in terms of mechanisms that effectively achieve net zero in the mind of the minister? Minister.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to repeat again that we're still working on protocols and system design, and no final decisions have been made. So I'm not sure speculation by me or personal preference is the best way to answer the question. But what I will say is that we are focused on emission reduction first and foremost, wherever possible. And wanting it to be real, needing it to be real, and we extend that to protocols, if there are to offsets. If there is going to be an offset used either to close a final gap or as a transition while technologies or process design or equipment is changed out in particular industries, they have to be verifiable. They have to be real. They have to meet stringent internationally accepted protocols and tests. They can't just be, I'm going to go out in the market and see who's selling an offset. It has to be something that the BC government is confident on behalf of British Columbians is real, verifiable, credible, and internationally acceptable.
Member.
So as the minister just outlined, a lot of the work is yet to be done, but yet this government continues to approve new emissions sources. Namely, in the last couple of weeks, a new LNG facility. Approved another LNG facility, which will have to meet that net zero requirement in the environmental assessment process, except none of that's in place. None of it exists yet, as the minister just said. It all still needs to be determined. So we've got an LNG facility going through the process that is yet to be clear. We have the Premier who said when he was being sworn in that increasing and adding new fossil fuel infrastructure is not consistent with meeting our climate targets, our emissions targets. So how do we reconcile the fact that on one hand, we are putting in place a framework that is going to reduce emissions, but yet the only real thing that's happened in the last couple of weeks is more emissions? How does that get reconciled?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I appreciate the member's concern, because the concern is around reducing emissions, meeting our climate targets, and addressing climate change, which is a concern that's shared across our government. I think for the member to say that the only thing that's happened in the last couple of weeks is more emissions is not true. A project was approved, it hasn't been built, and it hasn't even got a final investment decision. And I would rather choose to look at the entire framework, which is what we tried to announce a couple of weeks ago on March 14th. And first of all, that framework includes all the range of measures that we have taken under Clean BC, continue to take, whether it is reducing emissions in transportation, whether it is working toward zero carbon standards in buildings, supporting local governments for emission reduction activities, whether it is our very aggressive methane reduction regulations and program. But what we also announced 2 weeks ago, and I'm not sure the member fully understands this, while the implementation mechanisms will be consulted on with First Nations and with industry, this government announced and made a very clear commitment to a regulatory cap on emissions in the entire oil and gas sector that aligned with our targets, our Clean BC targets for the sector. That was the commitment we made. That is real. The methods of implementing that and applying it and will be worked on in the coming weeks, will be consulted on, and that was our commitment to do that consultation this year. But the commitment to bring forward a regulatory cap was an absolute commitment. It wasn't a we may do this, we're thinking about it, we're going to consult and see if people think it's a good idea. We made a commitment to do it, we're consulting on the mechanism to do it.
Member.
Thanks. So was the goal then to make the announcement to approve the Haisla-led Cedar LNG project and create a regulatory framework that makes it impossible for them to get a final investment decision again? That is seemingly where the first part of the minister's answer was going, was that make the approval, create the conditions for that project to not succeed.
Minister.
No, that was, thank you, sorry, Chair. No, that was certainly not a signal I intended to send, and I want to very clearly say that that's not the signal I was sending. That's not the intention. The intention was to not have our emission reduction activities with respect to any single project be determined by the approval or rejection of that project. The context that we created was to take what we announced as our sectoral reduction target for the oil and gas sector, which we announced at the same time as 3 other sectors, and say to British Columbians, we told you this is what we intend to do as part of Clean BC, and now we're making a commitment to do it through regulation.
Member.
So, thank you. When I made the statement that the thing that was announced was more emissions, I was making the assumption that Cedar LNG would get the final investment decision. The reason why I guess I'm a bit, I wouldn't say confused, but just looking for a little bit more clarity from the minister was that in the response it was that, well, yeah, the project has been approved, but there's been no final investment decision. And the reason why I asked the follow-up question is because the optimists, the people who are optimistic about the emissions cap, have basically told me, don't worry about it. Remember, the economics of this, if that emissions cap, if the net zero, none of this is going forward anyways. And so it just, I guess it just feels like, yeah, you can announce the Cedar LNG project. There's a First Nation up north that's very excited about that, been working on it for a long time, but yet then the project gets crushed because of the optimism that some are feeling around the energy action framework. So that's what's behind the line of questioning that I have here today.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. So I think what I hope British Columbians and others, including the member, the House Leader for the third party, will be optimistic about is that when we announced the new energy action framework, we made a commitment to accelerating electrification in British Columbia at all levels, that we made a commitment to expedite the transition to clean energy, both technologies and sources of clean energy that are going to be the energy sources of the future, and that we made a commitment to deal with the oil and gas sector as a whole in a fair way, and to bring in a regulation to reduce their emissions. You know, if some people may read what they want into a decision that will have a particular result, that wasn't what we were intending to to do, and I can't control what people choose to believe will be the outcomes. I think for the Haisla, and I'm not an investor who's going to make a decision about whether to invest in Cedar, but what I do know is that without a certificate, the Haisla were not in a very good position to talk to potential investors. They have a certificate now, and they are in that position, and it'll be the decision of investors about whether to invest in that project. But the optimism that people should feel is that we now have a clear commitment to use legal tools to reduce emissions in the sector in line with what we have to do to meet our legislated targets.
Member.
I think the skepticism that I have, and that's shared by, I won't say how many, but that's shared by some in this province, is that we had a premier that said that expanding the fossil fuel industry is not consistent with meeting our climate targets. 3 months later, we're expanding the fossil fuel industry. So the skepticism that I have about whether or not this government is prepared to actually deliver on what it says is in the fact that we have the leader of the province who led in a campaign to become the premier of the province, many people in a certain direction. And now here we are going in a different direction. So I guess I can, the other reality that we face is that up until this BC NDP government approved LNG Canada, we had zero LNG. So it wasn't even, or we had very little LNG. It wasn't even a transition in this province. We're creating the need to transition because we're creating the industry. We keep approving new projects, new sources of emissions. And now we're going to have this language about how we're going to have to transition away from an industry that we didn't even need to transition away from if the minister, the current Minister of the Environment, the former Premier, and now the current Premier, didn't approve these sources of emissions. We wouldn't have this problem. So what's inside the framework that is going to be consulted on and negotiated on in kind of a very unclear way, I can understand we're going to go out to industry, we're going to go out to and have that conversation. They're looking to rapidly expand this industry in this province. I would also say that the indication that I have from this provincial government with respect to this industry is, I think, characterized in the fact that, in the Yahey decision. It's very, very interesting that decision ended where it did, and I am appreciative of that. But the pressure on this government from the LNG industry very clearly had something to do with that decision. So here we are, we have a premier that says in an election to become the leader of the political party that runs the show in here, expanding fossil fuel infrastructure is inconsistent with meeting our climate goals. And a lot of people got excited about that. And yet just a few short months later, we're creating an industry that now we have to peel ourselves back from. So that's where the skepticism lies. Why, if we are so committed to climate change, are we creating huge sources of emissions that now everybody else, every other industry in this province has to make up for?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. And I appreciate that the member cares deeply about climate change and the future of British Columbia, and like I, wants British Columbia to be a leader. We differ somewhat on the different ways to get there. But I would say to the member's question at the end, which is why are we approving an industry that will result in us requiring other industries to make up the slack? That is precisely why we set one sectoral target for the oil and gas sector and one sectoral target for other industry, and why we brought in a new energy action framework that very specifically has a commitment to a regulatory cap that aligns with the oil and gas sectoral target in order to ensure that we meet it and that it doesn't fall on the backs of other industries or other people, or that we end up failing.
One more question, member?
Okay, all right, I've already shut my brain down. Thank you, Minister, for the response. I look forward to future engagements with you on this. I'm going to turn it over because I think his brain might still be working. That's good.